Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or wherever you may be, and welcome to today's, this morning's webinar. We're kind of doing a last-minute review of the 2020 rates, things that are going to affect in 4 days. Pardon my little voice this morning. Bad timing for a frog. So today we're going to talk about a few of the basics involved with a price change, the price changes themselves that were filed in 2019 to take effect in 2020. And then a few other things to watch as we go forward past the implementation date at the end of this month. So first of all, let's go over some of the things that are in the background here. As you know, now it's going on, so it's over 13 years ago that the Postal Accountability pardon me, and Enhancement Act was passed. And that replaced the 1970 era cost of service process. That process rather was used for over 30 years and was an adversarial presentation by both the Postal Service and interveners before the Postal Rate Commission back then. And it was a matter of who should pay the cost involved in the Postal Service's processing and delivery of mail. And it was always us versus them, us versus us in some cases, first class versus third class and so forth. But the PAEA changed all of that, divided Postal Service products or classes of mail into market dominant and competitive, and set some minimum notices to be given for price changes. As we all know, the market dominant products include first class, marketing mail or standard mail or formerly third class, periodicals, once known as second class, and package services, once known as fourth class. So that's where those came from. And of course, special services. Market dominant products, as you know, were covered by a CPI-based cap on price changes. And as was always the case, price changes that were proposed had to be reviewed by the PRC, which of course became the Postal Regulatory Commission after PAEA. Everything else, the competitive products, things which face marketplace competition from FedEx and UPS and others, were set separately into competitive products, express mail, priority mail, first class package service, and ground service packages, and related ancillary services. Those prices are not capped by a statutory device, but those are simply, if you will, self-regulated by the marketplace. Those prices are set by the Postal Service's governors. They declare the prices, and that's it. The PRC's review of those prices is solely to assure compliance with statute, and that primarily means they're covering their costs. So that's what we got right now. It's what we've had for the past 13 years is this two-bucket arrangement under which most of the things that we're involved in on a daily basis fall into the market dominant products. Now, cost coverage is a critical issue, something that you hear about a lot, something we talk about again today. And what it basically means is you're covering your expenses. You're paying the cost that can be assigned to the class of mail involved, whether it's first class or standard mail. And in most cases, you've got enough revenue being generated to cover those costs and to contribute to what's called institutional costs. Now, attributable costs are those that can be assigned directly to the class of mail because of something to do with how it's handled or processed or delivered. Institutional costs are those things that can't be assigned to anybody. The lights at postal headquarters, something like that. Those can't be assigned to a certain class. Now, some categories of mail, again, we're talking about market dominant, fall short by varying amounts, and some contribute very, very well. As you can see, those listed as contributors pay a lot more towards costs than the average. Pre-sorted first-class mail letters contribute almost 3 times their attributable cost, with the remainder going towards the institutional cost. On the flip side, you've got some things that simply aren't paying their way. Marketing flats and parcels, for example, and periodicals aren't even covering their own costs, let alone covering institutional costs and helping to keep the overall system running. Now, the PRC, of course, looks at this in the objective and somewhat detached sense and says everybody should be paying full cost coverage. Well, that's wonderful, but how are you going to raise the price on periodicals, for example, who are 36% short of covering their attributable costs, while at the same time respecting a CPI-based cap. That ain't going to happen. So there's one of the problems we've got, is you've got some things that are more than covering their costs and contributing very, very nicely towards institutional costs. Other things are falling way short of even paying their own way. So that's what we've got to deal with. We're looking at an overall general price change. Now the cap. The little charts here show you the cap and what's been going on with the cap. In the middle of the top chart, you can see where the arrow is pointing. That's where the rolling 12-month average was sitting a year and a half ago, in August of 2018. That's where it was, and then the rate increase that was used, that was then filed, used the 2.419 percentage that was then applicable. Over the following 12 months, as the bottom chart shows, the month-over-month change in the CPI cap was negative. It kept falling and falling and falling, and sometimes it fell by a good deal, by 0.1%, for example. So by the end of the 12-month period, when the Postal Service filed for the rates we're now seeing, when it filed for that in August of 2019, the cap was less than 2%. It was 1.9%. So while that may be something which you see as a good thing because, you know, that keeps rates down and helps keep people in the mail, the trouble on the other side is it also doesn't help pay the bills. The Postal Service's costs did not increase by only 1.9% over that 1 year. So we're having a situation where their costs are going up faster than their ability to raise prices. The rate authority is, of course, based upon the CPI cap. In the 2019 filing, things are going to be effective in 4 days. There's what the cap provided, 1.9%. From the previous rate cases and from different little adjustments along the way, there was a little bit of unused authority they could also add on. So the column you've got on the right, the top chart, shows you how much they had to work with. After the filing, they had a little bit left over again, a tiny little fraction, which wouldn't amount to a lot of money, but sometimes that little bit of a difference is useful. As you can see, periodicals had nothing to add, and they didn't leave anything on the table. Looking at the price changes for the classes of mail, how those broke out individually, and the cap, of course, is applied at the cap level, as a class level, rather. You can see how first class and special services had a little bit more than the 1.9%, while marketing and package services had a little bit less, and periodicals were right on the money. Again, within any class, you're going to have some rate cells and some price categories that change a little more or a little bit less because overall, compliance with the cap at the class level is based on a volume-weighted calculation. So a very small increase for a heavily populated type of mail is going to have either the same or less impact than would have, or a lot more impact rather, than would be a large change for a class or category rate cell that has very little volume. Looking further into first class, you can see that the prices for some of the retail products, single piece letters and cards, actually went down a little bit, whereas the price for postcards and pre-sort letters went up. Flats, of course, the perpetual problem with flats is their own cost coverage. So again, we see a sizable rate increase for flats in this case. Now, some of this, of course, as you'll see in a moment, is averaging out over 2 years. There were things done in 2018 that were averaged out by changes in 2019. Inbound letter post is something which is going to take care of itself because that's going to become covered by self-declared rates, and it's moving to competitive products. It has moved to competitive products as of the first of the year. And in July, the Postal Service will be able to have self-declared rates for what it charges foreign countries for incoming mail. Now, this chart here shows you that for single-piece rates, there was little or no change. QBRM went down by less than 0.2%, but otherwise, the price for a stamp, metered mail, for single-piece did not change. Now, you've got this Carlson down here issue reflects a case that was brought by this individual from California last year. He sued the Postal Service. He sued the PRC rather for failing to adequately justify allowing the Postal Service to raise the price of a stamp when it did the year, in 2018, raising the price of a stamp by a nickel. And he felt that was too much, that all the different factors in the law did not get proper consideration. So he sued, and at the end of the day, the court said that the problem was that the PRC failed to articulate its thinking, failed to use what they called reasoned decision making. So, long story short, at this point, the price of a stamp is the same after the price increase that we're putting into effect next week was adjudicated. Carlson's issues were resolved. He hasn't come up above ground since then, so presumably that has been settled. But again, it was an instructive event for the PRC to make sure that it properly documents and explains what it does and why it approves what it approves. The pricing for flats, of course, you can see over here went up by a ton, and of course for the keys and ID devices category, which is something which I don't even know how much volume there is anymore. But now you have to look at all of this kind of in comparison to last year. What were the changes last year, and what were the changes this year? And over the course of the 2 years, how do they add up? This is the chart showing what's happening, for example, in pre-sort categories, where you've got a change of 2% or better for letters and some sizable increases for some of the flats categories. Look at the non-automation and the other categories at the heavier weights. You've got price changes of 20% or more. But now, again, look at this over the course of 2 years. There's a comparison. The top chart shows you the changes that occurred in 2018 that took effect in last January. The bottom chart shows you things that are taking effect in 4 days. So if you kind of compare the price changes from last year and this year, particularly for flats, you'll see how, it more or less came out in the middle, and it more or less came out to a relatively normal, relatively on par change if you took the two as offsetting numbers. For example, 20 mixed ADC at 13 ounces, a 21.6% decrease last year, a 23.3% increase last year. So you're saying to yourself, why do they do these crazy things? Well, don't forget, last year the price of the stamp was bumped by a nickel. The cap is at the class level. So you're going to or assign that much of the rate increase to one part of first class. You've got to do things elsewhere in first class to offset it. So last year, that's what they did. There were offsetting decreases in the price of flats to compensate for the nickel increase in retail first class. Again, even though there may be no correlation in your mind between a pre-sorted flat and a retail letter, the cap is at the class level. It's based on weighted average, so you got to work things out so the math works. Now, in 2019, there is no increase for the stamp, so they had a chance to recoup some of the things they gave away last year and bring the price of flats back up to full cost coverage. It's kind of a confusing situation, but if you look at it over the 2-year period, in its own way, I guess it kind of works out. Now, looking at marketing mail, the class average there was just under 1.9%. But again, within the class, you see some things changing more and some things changing less. Letters are about on par. The higher density things, carrier out, HD saturation, and so forth, were below the class level increase. But flats and parcels, things that are chronically a problem in terms of cost coverage, those got a price change much higher than the average. In part, this is because of instructions from the Postal Regulatory Commission. When they look at some of the cost coverage issues, they tell the Postal Service, next price change, you will raise prices by X amount above the cap. So looking again at the whole category, the whole class of mail, you're going to raise flats and parcels by 3.9% in order to keep some semblance of cost coverage going. You have to raise other types of mail within the class by less to keep things in balance. And of course, you've also got to maintain some kind of logical rate relationship. You can't take a discount of one type and raise it above the logical relationship to another type of mail. That would apply, for example, to destination entry. You have to have reasonable relationships there. You can't make one level of pre-sort exorbitantly different from what it would be compared to another class. Comparing, for example, carrier route and high density. You've got to make some kind of logical relationship. And then you have nonprofit rates that whose contribution is set by law at a certain proportion to commercial rates. So there's a lot of push-pull here. There's a lot of tweaking and adjusting to making sure that all the moving parts work out and the math comes out to the right number at the end of the day. Looking at things a little more closely, you'll see the same circumstances manifesting this year as you had seen in the past. You've got some situations where prices went up a lot in 2019, or 18 rather. Let me get this straight, 2020 and 2019 because of consecutive changes or adjustments that went up and down. In this case here, you've got a lot of black numbers, things that weren't changed. You have some things that were a little bit more. The term pass-through means has to do with discounts. The PRC is very concerned that the Postal Service provides more reward to mailers in terms of pass-through than they should be getting based upon the work that they save the Postal Service. If you provide some sort of work sharing effort, if you destination enter, if you pre-sort, if you add automation, there's a specific value to that characteristic, to that work. And if you are given full benefit, then the pass-through to you is 100%. If you're given more benefit than you deserve, the pass-through is too high. It's over 100%. And the PRC does not like that. So some of what you see going on here is corrections to pass-throughs that exceeded the 100% level. Comparing, again, what we saw last year to what we see this year, you can see how some numbers, that did not change this year, changed a lot last year, some, and vice versa. In many cases, the heavier pieces are seeing increases year over year. In some cases, you're seeing the less pre-sorted pieces getting a greater change because, again, of adjustments to pass-throughs. So there's a lot of things going on in the background here, not just simply an effort to jack up prices. Non-machinable, for example, look at the prices for non-machinable items that went up 5.4% last year for 5-digit and 6.7% this year. Why? Well, for one thing, there's a higher work content to that. And if you've got non-machinable items, they, of course, are more difficult to process than things that are machinable or things that are highly pre-sorted or things that are automation compatible. Looking at the prices for flats, again, same pattern. You see things that are a little bit lower in work content getting no discount, getting no increase rather. Things that have higher work content getting a greater increase. Again, pass-throughs in the background are being adjusted, and some things that are happening here are purely to increase the cost coverage of the particular rate involved. Although everything that happens ultimately at the class level, things are going on within the class, individual categories and pre-sort levels, where the Postal Service knows costs aren't being covered. So they have to look at those rate cells, those categories, those pre-sort levels, for example, a little more closely, and make adjustments there to bring up not just the cell, not just the category, but the class of mail and the type of mail, flats, for example, more up to the level it should be at to cover the costs that are attributed to that type of mail. So that's a lot of what's going on here. Comparing, again, for flats, you see year over year a steady drumbeat of price increases because of the cost coverage issue for flats. Some situations are worse than others. Looking at the top and bottom charts, you can see that the carrier route area is probably being treated the most kindly, whereas non-automation flats, at least in the 2019 rate change to be effective later this month, you can see some of them getting significant price increases because, again, of cost coverage concerns, rectifying prior changes. Last year, for example, some went down in nonprofit, taking back some of that and making the class of mail and the categories cover their cost and contribute, of course, to the overall cost of the class. Again, looking at what you have for 4 ounce, for things over 4 ounces, same idea. Top is last year, bottom is this year, and you can see how there were changes last year or no changes last year, and the reverse is happening, maybe happening this year. But the theme is the same. When you've got higher cost items, you've got pass-throughs to be adjusted, you've got cost coverage concerns, you can see that the same considerations are being applied year over year, even when sometimes those may look disproportionate compared to other types of mail within the class. A couple of things that were going on in marketing mail. There was a differentiation for the first time between different types of detached address label. Now they're calling one of them detached address labels, DALs, with no ads, and then we have detached marketing labels, the same physical item, but with an ad on it. They raised the price for the two differently because they believe the latter, the DML, has a greater value to the mailer. So in that case, they figured, well, you're going to make money on it, you're going to afford to pay us a little bit more. That whether that's going to actually work out, will, because they'll look to see whether or not there is actually a change in usage of that type of mail product. Overall, you have, again, the same factors going on. Changes happening because of pass-throughs, changes happening because of work share discounts, changes happening because of cost coverage concerns. And the Postal was repeated this year, as it had in the past, that these should be looked at not as a one-year isolated event, but as something which is happening as part of a longer-term cycle or longer-term strategy to increase rates for those that are short of cost coverage, and just to overall make adjustments that make sense in the longer term. Whether, of course, you agree with those making sense or whether you agree with that they're making the right changes is a matter of where you sit. Who mail a lot of flats, for example, may not be too sympathetic with the idea of cost coverage because they're going to see larger increases. But at the end of the day, the Postal Service is required by law to increase prices to cover its costs. Periodicals, of course, is a good example. The Postal Service has serious problems in cost coverage within the class. It's primarily flats. It's almost entirely flats. Therefore, anything being done to rectify the problem of flats cost coverage is going to have a huge impact on periodicals. But even here, they can't do anything above the cap. So if you needed to bring periodicals rates up by, pick a number, 15% in order to have full cost coverage, the cap is keeping them from doing so. If you go on to other classes of mail package services, for example, bound printed matter flats are also a problem, as are media mail and library mail falling short of cost coverage, but the same cap issue remains here. And in package services, of course, what you have left now is mostly bound printed matter, media mail, library mail, and some of the Alaska bypass. So there's the situation for them. In special services, that was all over the map. It's a class, I guess you can call it that. 1.9%, just over 1.9% in overall. But some things went up a good deal. Some things went up a lot less. Sometimes to deal cost coverage issues. Sometimes a matter of simply taking a little bit more revenue in situations where the Postal Service believed it was able to do so because of market circumstances. Now, looking at the promotions, of course, those were carried forward from last year, and there has been very little change at the higher level. Looking over the past several years, these are pretty much the same promotions that were offered in the past. Little red dotted line there says where we are historically right now. Most of these lie in the future, and most of these, as I said, are similar to what was offered in the past. There are subtle changes, small changes within each. So if you're interested in taking advantage of any of these, I'd urge you to look on Postal Pro to make sure you look through the details of what the particular promotion requires, to be timely in submitting any kind of samples that may be required, and to make sure that whatever you're doing qualifies for the discounts you're hoping to get. These will continue, of course, through the end of the year. Someone asked me yesterday if these have been successful. Year over year, the Postal Service reports pretty consistent increases in participation. So from that standpoint, I guess they have been successful. Whether they've kept people in the mail who might otherwise have left is a matter of controversy. How much mail would have happened is always something that's hard to nail down. But those are the promotions for this year. And again, please look at the specifics of each to make sure you've met all the requirements. Looking at competitive prices, those were pretty much a non-issue. The governor's authorized increases in the retail and commercial rates for all the competitive products, which more or less were in line with what is happening elsewhere in the marketplace. Price increases by FedEx and UPS, for example. What they aren't doing is adding hidden surcharges. For example, this morning I had somebody brought to my attention that FedEx is putting a $24 a piece surcharge on items over 50 pounds. Well, the prices you see here, the charts that are published by the Postal Service, show you the prices that you're going to pay. In some situations, you've got NSAs, negotiated service agreements, that may be even lower than these prices. But nobody is going to be saying the Postal Service is putting on a $24 surcharge. So the price changes themselves, as you recall. The notice is in the law. 45 days for market dominant, 30 for competitive. Actually, we were given almost 4 months notice. Everything happened over the course of the fall. There was a glitch involving first-class mail because of the inbound letter class, which is an international product. That worked itself out, and in a couple of releases in December, the Postal Service got approval for the rest of its first-class rates. Competitive products were approved in November, so everything is happening, as we've said, at the end of this month. Now, other things to keep track of course, the whole world is not going to be satisfied at the end of January. There are other things going on. We've got 5 governors right now, but 1 seat is going to be coming open soon, and there are still 4 others that are open. We haven't seen any activity to fill those positions. We're going to need them at some point. There are some serious changes going on regarding state sales and use tax laws and state privacy laws that you really should be paying attention to. We had a webinar yesterday about privacy laws. We'll have webinars in the future about both those topics because there are things that you should be watching closely. As we mentioned earlier, July 1st, self-declared rates are going to be imposed for international mail, for incoming mail, and other countries will be imposing rates on what we send to them. So this should be interesting. We don't know what's going to happen to costs under new labor agreements. They're not going to go down, I'll guarantee you that. but a couple of the unions are still negotiating their labor agreements, so we'll see what happens there. A worry for all of us should be the loss of parcel volume, which is a big source of revenue for the Postal Service, because shippers are insourcing things now because of higher volume. What used to go to the Postal Service, for example, Amazon, now is being delivered by Amazon's little trucks running around the world. So there's a decrease in revenue that is going to be hard to replace from any other source. And of course, there's always this issue of postal reform. What's going to happen? What's Congress going to do? Well, as far as I can see, Congress isn't doing much except arguing. So I don't hold out a lot of hope for them to do anything useful for the Postal Service. So that's about where things stand right now. If you have any questions, let me check and see if we've got any questions here. I don't see any at the moment. So hopefully, if you've had your questions, anything in your mind answered. If you do have questions that pop up at some point over the next few days, excuse me, just drop us a line. There is the email, and of course, if you have any other concerns, you can contact us about those as well. We will have webinars in the future. Our next webinar is in February. I believe it's on the 17th. And it's going to be starting a series on training for newcomers, people who are new to the business. So it's mailing for beginners. It's a course we're going to have. Then more information about that coming out in the near future. We of course have monthly webinars going scheduled for the whole year. Sign up for those at the website you see on your screen there, MailingTopWebinars.com. We'll have our next newsletter coming out in about 10 days. It's every 2 weeks, so hopefully you'll be reading that. And again, if you have any questions, please give us a buzz somehow. The presentation and the handout will be available to you. The handout, as you can see, is right there on the screen. Just download that. If you need additional copies or something else, just drop us a note. And the recordings, as I said, will be available soon for anybody who wishes to listen to it again. I'm not seeing any other questions. I want to thank everyone for calling in today. Thank Michelle in the background over there for being the person who keeps the lights on and everything happening here the way it should. And of course, for those who helped us organize and publicize today's webinar. Thank you again. And until we talk again, please take care. Talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.